The hydraulic lift hissed as Sarah Chun lowered the Humvee back to the garage floor, grease streaking her forearms in dark lines that matched the oil stains on her coveralls. She'd been elbow deep in the transmission for 3 hours, and the Afghanistan heat made the motor pool feel like working inside an oven. Around her, the forward operating base hummed with the controlled chaos of a combat zone during operational prep. Helicopters throttled up on the flight line. Operators moved between buildings with that purposeful stride that meant mission launch was close. She wiped her hands on a rag that was probably dirtier than her skin and glanced toward the Tactical Operations Center. Through the dust-streaked window, she could see the SEAL team gathered around the briefing table. Lieutenant Marcus Webb stood at the head, pointing at satellite imagery spread across the surface. His team leaned in, faces serious, weapons already staged near the door. She recognized the pre-mission energy. She'd felt it herself more times than she could count, back when she wore a different uniform and carried a different designation. "Hey, mechanic." The voice cut through the garage noise. She turned to find Petty Officer Dalton standing in the bay entrance, arms crossed, that familiar smirk on his face. "My truck's making a weird noise. Think you can figure it out, or should I ask someone who actually knows engines?" Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Weird noise isn't much to go on." "What kind of weird?" Dalton shrugged. "I don't know. That's your job to figure out. We got a mission in 2 hours, and I need that vehicle ready. Think you can handle that?" She nodded once. "Bring it around. I'll take a look." He walked away without a thank you, already pulling out his phone. Through the open bay, she watched him rejoin 2 other SEALs near the armory. They were laughing about something. One of them glanced toward the motor pool and said something that made the others laugh harder. She didn't need to hear the words. She'd been on this base for 6 months. She knew exactly what they thought of her. Just the mechanic. The woman who fixed their trucks and kept the generators running and made sure their gear didn't fall apart in the middle of nowhere. Support personnel. Non-essential. Someone who existed in the background of their war. Where are you watching from? Drop your state or country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Sarah returned to the Humvee, checking the transmission fluid level with mechanical precision. Her hands moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this particular job 1,000 times. Because she had. Mechanic work was repetitive, predictable, safe. It required focus without demanding the kind of hypervigilance that used to define her existence. No one shot at you when you were changing oil. No one died if you took an extra second to double-check your work. The radio on her belt crackled. "All personnel, mission brief in 15 minutes, TOC main floor. Unit leads and support chiefs only." She wasn't a unit lead. She wasn't a support chief. She was a mechanic. The brief would cover the operation she wasn't invited to participate in, using intelligence she wasn't cleared to review, planning tactics she was expected to stay away from. She'd fix the vehicles they'd use, prep the generators that would keep the lights on while they were gone, and wait in the motor pool until they came back. If they came back, Lieutenant Webb emerged from the TOC, his team following in a loose formation. They moved past the motor pool without a glance in her direction. She was part of the scenery, furniture that happened to wear a uniform. Webb was talking to his second in command, and fragments of conversation drifted across the compound. Fortified compound, 18 tangos confirmed, possible civilians in the mix. We go in fast, extract the target, exfil before they know what hit them. His voice carried the confidence of someone who'd run dozens of missions just like this one. Sarah knew that confidence. She'd worn it herself once, before she'd seen how quickly confidence could turn into overconfidence and overconfidence could turn into body bags. She focused on the transmission. The metal was warm under her hands. The smell of engine oil was familiar, grounding. This was her job now. This was the life she'd chosen when she'd walked away from the other one. No judgment calls that got people killed. No 3 a.m. decisions about acceptable losses. No faces that showed up in her dreams with questions she couldn't answer. Dalton's truck rumbled into the bay 20 minutes later. She performed the diagnostic with efficiency, identified a loose belt tensioner, and had it fixed in 40 minutes. He barely acknowledged her when he picked up the keys, already mentally on whatever mission was spinning up. As sunset painted the compound in shades of orange and red, she watched the SEAL team final check their gear. They loaded into 3 vehicles, weapons hot, faces painted, moving with that focused intensity that came before stepping into the dark. The trucks rolled out through the main gate, and the base settled into the waiting quiet that followed every mission launch. Sarah returned to the motor pool and sat on the hood of a half-repaired truck, watching the gate. The desert stretched beyond the wire, endless and hostile and full of people who wanted everyone on this base dead. Out there in that darkness, Lieutenant Webb and his team were moving toward whatever target command had designated as important enough to risk American lives. She hoped they knew what they were doing. She hoped their intelligence was solid and their planning was tight and their execution would be flawless. But hope, she'd learned a long time ago, wasn't much of a strategy. The night shift in the motor pool meant working under portable lights that cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Sarah had 3 vehicles in various states of repair, and the mission timeline meant all of them needed to be operational by dawn. She worked methodically through the checklist, replacing brake pads on one truck, rewiring a faulty electrical system on another, running diagnostics on the third. The radio chatter from the operations center filtered through her headset. Standard traffic, position reports, communications checks. The SEAL team was 2 hours into their mission, moving through the insertion phase with professional efficiency. Everything sounded routine. She torqued down the last bolt on the brake assembly and moved to the electrical system. The wiring harness had taken damage from something, maybe small arms fire, maybe just the brutal conditions that broke everything out here eventually. She traced each wire with practiced fingers, finding the breaks, splicing in new sections, heat-shrinking the connections to military specifications. Major Kim walked past the motor pool around midnight, his boots crunching on gravel. He glanced inside, saw her working, and kept walking. No acknowledgement, no check-in. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Invisible. The base operated on a skeleton crew during mission hours. Most personnel were either out on operations or catching sleep between shifts. The few people moving around had specific jobs that kept them focused on their own tasks. Sarah had learned the rhythm of this place, the patterns that governed who went where and when. She knew which buildings stayed lit all night and which ones went dark after 2,200 hours. She knew the guard rotation on the perimeter and the blind spots in the camera coverage and exactly how long it took to move from one end of the compound to the other without being seen. Not that she needed to know any of that. She was a mechanic. The electrical repair took 90 minutes. She tested every circuit twice, running the full diagnostic suite until the computer confirmed 0 faults. The truck would run. The lights would work. The radio would function. Someone would drive this vehicle into a combat zone, and their life might depend on the quality of her work, so she triple-checked everything. By 200 hours, all 3 vehicles were ready. She logged the maintenance in the computer system, noting the parts used and hours worked and the status of each truck. The paperwork was tedious but necessary. Everything in the military required documentation. Every action needed a paper trail. Every decision needed to be justified in writing. She grabbed a canteen and walked to the edge of the motor pool, looking out at the desert beyond the wire. The stars were brilliant out here, undimmed by light pollution, scattered across the sky in patterns that had guided travelers for thousands of years. Somewhere under those same stars, Lieutenant Webb and his team were conducting their operation. Fast Insertion, quick extraction, in and out before the enemy could respond. The radio crackled. Actual, this is Raven 6. We have eyes on the target building. Preparing to breach. She recognized Webb's voice. Calm. Professional. The tone of someone who'd done this too many times to get nervous about it anymore. There was a certain comfort in that confidence. It meant he trusted his training, trusted his team, trusted the planning that had put them in position. Raven 6, actual copies. You're cleared hot. Execute at your discretion. Sarah drained the canteen and returned to the motor pool. She still had a generator that needed a new fuel filter and a Humvee with a transmission that was making suspicious noises. The work never stopped. Equipment broke. Things needed fixing. That was the nature of machinery in a combat environment. Everything degraded. Everything failed eventually. She was replacing the fuel filter when Sergeant Morrison from Supply dropped off a requisition form. Need you to sign off on these parts. They're for your motor pool inventory. She scanned the list, found everything in order, and signed at the bottom. Morrison took the form and hesitated, glancing at the radio on her belt. You monitoring the op? Standard procedure. In case they need vehicle recovery. He nodded. They're good operators. They'll be fine. Usually are, Sarah said. Morrison left, and she finished the fuel filter replacement. The generator rumbled to life on the first try, settling into a steady rhythm that would keep the lights on for another 1,000 hours before the next scheduled maintenance. She made a note in the logbook and moved to the Humvee with the transmission issue. The problem was in the torque converter. She could hear in the way the engine loaded when she revved it, that slight hesitation that meant something inside wasn't engaging properly. It would require dropping the transmission, which meant at least 6 hours of work, which meant this vehicle wouldn't be ready until sometime tomorrow afternoon. She keyed her radio. TOC, this is Motor Pool. Vehicle 7 is down for transmission work. Estimated repair time, 6 hours minimum. Copy Motor Pool. Vehicle 7 is code red until further notice. Code red meant deadline. Unavailable for operations. One less truck in the fleet. The base could absorb the loss temporarily, but if casualties came in or an emergency evacuation became necessary, every vehicle mattered. She'd have to work fast. The radio traffic from the SEAL team continued in the background. Controlled. Professional. They'd breached the target building and were clearing rooms with the systematic efficiency of trained operators. No complications. No surprises. Everything according to plan. Sarah positioned the hydraulic jack under the Humvee and started raising it. The transmission would be heavy, awkward, covered in oil and grime. It would fight her every step of the way. But she'd done this particular job at least 50 times across different vehicles in different countries. Her hands knew the bowl patterns. Her muscles knew the weight. Her mind knew the sequence. Just another night in the motor pool. Just another repair on just another truck. The SEAL team would complete their mission and return to base, and someone would drive this Humvee on the next operation, and the cycle would continue. Her role in that cycle was simple. Keep the machines running. Stay in the background. Do the job that nobody noticed until something broke. She was 3 bolts into the transmission removal when the radio traffic changed. The controlled professional voices suddenly carried a different edge. Sharper. Faster. The tone that meant something had gone wrong. Contact left. Contact left. Multiple tangos. Second floor windows. The transmission hung suspended on the jack, half disconnected, but Sarah's hands had already stopped moving. She focused on the radio traffic, reading the situation through the fragments of communication that cut through the static. Raven 6 taking fire. We are pinned in the courtyard. Request immediate support. The professional calm in Webb's voice had fractured. Not panic, but the sharp urgency of someone whose plan had just collided with reality. Sarah set down her wrench and moved to the radio console mounted on the motor pool wall. Raven 6, actual. What is your status? We have casualties. 2 wounded. Building was supposed to be clear, but we have at least 30 hostiles, maybe more. This isn't the intel package we briefed. The operations center would be erupting right now. Officers shouting orders. Communications specialists trying to coordinate support. Someone pulling up satellite feeds to understand what had gone wrong. Sarah had seen it before. The controlled chaos that followed when an operation went sideways. She walked to the motor pool entrance and looked toward the TOC. Lights blazed in every window. Personnel were running between buildings. Major Kim emerged and headed for the flight line, probably to prep medevac helicopters for casualty extraction. The base had shifted into crisis mode in the span of 30 seconds. Raven 6, air support, is 18 minutes out. Can you hold position? Negative. We are combat ineffective and taking sustained fire. We need to extract now. Sarah's jaw tightened. Combat ineffective meant they couldn't fight their way out. 18 minutes was an eternity in a firefight. Webb and his team were trapped in a courtyard somewhere in the desert, outnumbered and running out of options. She returned to the Humvee and stared at the half-removed transmission. The repair would take hours she didn't have. But Vehicle 7 wasn't the only truck on base. She scanned the motor pool, mentally cataloging what was available. 3 fully operational Humvees. 2 MRAPs. 1 technical that probably wouldn't survive off-road terrain, but could move in an emergency. Not that any of it mattered. She wasn't an operator. She wasn't part of the tactical response. Her job was to fix trucks, not drive them into combat zones. The radio crackled with updates. The quick reaction force was spinning up, but they needed time to gear up and coordinate the rescue. Air support was inbound, but still 15 minutes out. Every update felt like watching a countdown timer tick toward 0 while knowing you couldn't stop it. Raven 6, actual. QRF is preparing to roll. Hold your position. We don't have a position to hold. We are falling back to secondary structure, but it is not secure. Multiple casualties now. We need extraction immediately. Sarah grabbed her canteen and drained it, the water doing nothing to cut the tension building in her chest. She knew the math. She knew how long it took to organize a rescue operation and how fast a firefight could deteriorate and what happened when those 2 timelines didn't align. Personnel streamed past the motor pool, moving with purpose toward their crisis stations. The base had transformed from quiet night operations to full alert. Generators kicked into higher output. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter. Guards doubled on the walls. She wasn't part of any of it. She stood in the motor pool, surrounded by vehicles and tools and the machinery that kept everything running, but none of her skills mattered in this moment. The SEAL team needed shooters, not mechanics. They needed tactical support, not someone who could rebuild a transmission. The next radio call came through with more static, the signal degrading. Actual, Raven 6. We're boxed in. Multiple wounded, including myself. Running low on ammunition. They are preparing to assault our position. There was something in Webb's voice now that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly, but the acknowledgement that this situation had moved beyond difficult into potentially catastrophic. Sarah had heard that tone before, usually right before someone made a desperate decision. Raven 6, hold on. QRF is rolling in 5 minutes. Air support in 10. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Might as well be 5 hours if you were trapped in a building with hostiles closing in from all sides. Sarah knew the brutal arithmetic of combat. She knew how much could go wrong in 60 seconds, let alone 5 minutes. She walked the length of the motor pool, past the tools and parts and equipment that defined her current existence. 6 months ago, she'd accepted this assignment specifically because it was far from the sharp end of operations. No tactical decisions. No life and death calls. Just engines and transmissions and electrical systems that either worked or didn't. But 6 months ago, Lieutenant Webb wasn't bleeding in a courtyard surrounded by hostiles. Major Kim's voice cut through the command channel. All personnel, we have a situation developing with Raven 6. Quick Reaction Force is preparing to deploy. All non-essential personnel maintain positions and stay clear of the flight line and vehicle staging areas. Non-essentiel personnel. That's what she was. Essential enough to fix their trucks, but not essential enough to be part of the response when those trucks were actually needed. She understood the reasoning. The military ran on specialization. Everyone had their lane. You stayed in your lane and let others handle theirs. She returned to the suspended transmission and stared at it. The bolts she'd removed were lined up in careful order on the workbench. The replacement parts were staged and ready. She could finish this job, have the truck operational by dawn, and everything would return to normal. Except Lieutenant Webb and his team might not make it to dawn. The radio traffic continued. Updates from the QRF. Communications with air support. Fragments of conversation from Webb's position that came through increasingly broken up. The situation was deteriorating in real time, and everyone on base could hear happening. Sarah made a decision. She crossed to the locked cabinet at the rear of the motor pool and pulled out a set of keys that weren't supposed to exist. The cabinet opened to reveal gear that definitely wasn't standard motor pool equipment. Body armor, a rifle, night vision, medical supplies, ammunition, everything she'd kept stored away for 6 months, telling herself she'd never need again. She started pulling on the gear with practiced efficiency. The body armor settled onto her shoulders with familiar weight. The rifle felt natural in her hands despite the months since she'd last carried one. The night vision mounted to her helmet with a click that brought back 1,000 memories she'd been trying to forget. This was a terrible idea. She knew it was a terrible idea. Command would have her court-martialed if she survived long enough to face a court-martial. But terrible ideas were sometimes the only options left when all the good ideas had already failed. Sarah threw her gear into the passenger seat of the nearest operational Humvee and fired up the engine. The motor pool gate was open, vehicle staging for the QRF still 10 minutes away from being ready. She had a window, small but enough. The Humvee rolled out of the motor pool and turned toward the main gate. The guard saw a military vehicle with base markings driven by someone in full combat gear. They saw what they expected to see. The gate opened and she drove through without slowing down. The desert road stretched ahead, illuminated by her headlights cutting through darkness. She killed the lights after 200 meters and activated night vision. The world turned green and flat, distance compressing into layers of shadow. She'd driven these roads before, back when she wore different insignia and carried different authorization. The routes hadn't changed. The dangers hadn't either. Her radio erupted 30 seconds after she cleared the gate. Motor pool, this is TOC. We have an unauthorized vehicle departure. Confirm your status. She didn't respond. Confirmation would only give them time to organize a recall. Better to let them figure it out on their own timeline while she created distance. All stations, this is actual. We have a stolen vehicle heading east from the base. Identify the driver and establish communications immediately. Sarah smiled grimly and pushed the accelerator down. The Humvee wasn't fast, but it was reliable and it had armor it would get her where she needed to go. The GPS showed the target compound 14 kilometers northeast. The QRF would take the main road, approach from the south with overwhelming force. Standard tactical doctrine. Predictable. She took a turn onto a goat trail that barely qualified as a path. The Humvee bucked over rocks and gouges in the terrain. Her teeth rattled. Equipment shifted in the back. But this route would cut 5 kilometers off the approach and bring her in from the west, where the hostiles wouldn't be expecting contact. Motor pool, TOC. If you can hear this transmission, abort your movement and return to base immediately. You are not authorized for this operation. Major Kim's voice carried an edge of panic now. Someone had finally checked the motor pool and discovered not just a missing vehicle, but missing equipment and an empty gear cabinet that shouldn't have contained tactical equipment in the first place. They were putting pieces together, and none of those pieces formed a picture that made sense. She checked her weapon. Magazine seated. Round chambered. Safety on until she needed it off. The rifle was a standard M4, nothing special, but she qualified expert with it more times than she could count. Muscle memory didn't fade, just because you stopped using it for a few months. The radio traffic from Webb's position had gone sporadic. Short bursts of communication followed by long silences. Running low on everything. Ammunition. Time. Options. The QRF was finally rolling, but they were still 8 minutes out and approaching from the wrong direction. Sarah navigated around a cluster of rocks and corrected her heading. The terrain out here was treacherous at night, even with night vision. One wrong turn could drop the Humvee into a ravine or bog it down in soft sand. She drove with focused intensity, reading the landscape through years of experience operating in similar environments. TOC, this is QRF lead. We have visual on a vehicle moving cross-country toward the target area. Cannot confirm identity, but it's not one of ours on any authorized route. That's our stolen vehicle. Disregard and continue your approach. We will handle the unauthorized operator after we extract Raven 6. Sarah was 4 kilometers from the target now, close enough that she killed the engine and continued on foot. The Humvee sat in a dry wash, concealed by terrain, ready for extraction if she managed to pull this off. If she didn't manage it, the vehicle's location wouldn't matter much. She moved through the darkness with her rifle up, scanning sectors, reading the environment. The compound appeared as a darker shadow against dark terrain. Two-story structure, walls on 3 sides. The 4th side opened to a courtyard where muzzle flashes strobed in irregular patterns. The firefight was still active. She counted hostiles. 16 visible on the exterior, moving between covered positions, coordinating fire into the compound. More will be inside. Intel had called for 18 total tangos. Webb had reported 30. Reality was probably somewhere between those numbers, and all of them were focused on killing the SEAL team trapped in the courtyard. Sarah dropped prone behind a low ridge 60 meters from the compound's western wall. She controlled her breathing and assessed firing positions. The hostiles were exposed, confident, operating under the assumption that no threat existed outside their immediate engagement area. They were wrong. She keyed her radio to the SEAL team frequency. Raven 6, this is Angel. I am in position west of your location, preparing to engage hostiles on your perimeter. When shooting starts, move to the west wall. The response came after 5 seconds of silence. Who the hell is Angel? Identify yourself immediately. Webb's voice carried confusion and frustration. Sarah didn't blame him. An unknown call sign appearing out of nowhere, claiming to be in position to provide support, made zero tactical sense. No time for explanations. When you hear contact west side, you move. Acknowledge. Another pause. Then Webb's voice, tight with pain and exhaustion. Acknowledged. We'll move on your signal. Sarah settled her breathing and acquired her first target. A hostile on the western wall, silhouetted against the night sky. Rifle pointed down into the courtyard. Range 58 meters. Wind negligible. Clear line of sight. She squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle coughed, and the hostile dropped. She was already transitioning to the second target before the first one hit the ground. 2-round cinemass. The hostiles stumbled backward and fell. Third target. Fourth target. Fifth target. She worked through them with methodical precision, each shot placed with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this exact job in a dozen different countries against 100 different enemies. The hostiles on the west wall died before they understood they were under attack. The compound erupted in chaos. Hostiles shouted warnings and returned fire toward her position, but they were shooting at muzzle flash in darkness, and she'd already displaced 10 meters from her original spot. She dropped 2 more tangos who exposed themselves searching for her location. Inside the compound, Webb's team was moving. She could see them through her night vision, for operators carrying 2 wounded, fighting toward the west wall while the hostiles' attention was split between the courtyard and the unexpected threat outside. Sarah shifted position again and engaged targets on the north wall. 3 hostiles trying to flank toward her location. She put them down with controlled pairs, center mass shots that eliminated threats without wasting ammunition. Her magazine went dry, and she reloaded without looking, hands performing the actions through pure muscle memory. The SEAL team reached the west wall. Webb was first over, moving despite the blood darkening his uniform. His teammates followed, dragging the wounded, returning fire to cover their movement. They were clear of the immediate kill zone, but still deep in hostile territory with enemies converging from all directions. Sarah keyed her radio. Raven 6, move west 200 meters. I have vehicle extraction ready. Who are you? Someone who fixes trucks. Now move. Sarah provided covering fire as the SEAL team moved toward her position. Hostiles were pouring out of the compound now, at least 20 visible in her night vision. They'd realized their prisoners were escaping and committed everything to stopping the extraction. She dropped 3 tangos advancing across open ground, then displaced again before return fire could zero in on her location. Movement and accuracy. The fundamentals that kept you alive when outnumbered. She'd learned them in training a decade ago and refined them through operations that never made it into official reports. Webb reached her position first, his face paint streaked with sweat and blood. He took one look at her through his night vision and his expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. "You're the mechanic," he said. "Right now I'm your ride home. Keep moving." His team arrived seconds later, two operators carrying Petty Officer Morrison, who had a tourniquet on his leg and wasn't conscious. Another SEAL, Dalton, had taken a round through his shoulder but was still mobile. The team was combat effective, but barely, running on adrenaline and training while their bodies started shutting down from blood loss and exhaustion. Sarah led them through the darkness toward the Humvee, moving in a tactical formation that put her on point. She checked corners that didn't exist in open terrain, cleared angles in the featureless desert, operated with the systematic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on never missing a detail. "Hostile movement left flank," Webb called out. She'd already seen them. Four tangos trying to cut off their escape route, moving fast through a dry wash. She dropped to one knee and engaged. For shots. 4 targets down. The team kept moving. Her radio crackled with traffic from multiple sources. The QRF was closing on the compound from the south, finally in position to assault. Air support had arrived, jets screaming overhead, waiting for clearance to engage. Command was trying to coordinate everything while simultaneously demanding answers about the unauthorized operator who had somehow inserted into the middle of their crisis. "All stations identify Angel. Who is operating under that call sign?" Sarah ignored the question and focused on keeping her team alive. Her team. That's what they were now, whether Command recognized it or not. She'd pulled them out of the compound, and that made them her responsibility until they reached safety. The Humvee appeared ahead, exactly where she'd left it. She'd covered almost a kilometer of hostile terrain while providing security, and the vehicle sat untouched. Small victories. "Load up," she ordered. Wounded in first. Webb's team moved with professional efficiency despite their condition. They loaded Morrison and secured him, then piled in around him. Dalton took the turret position even with his wounded shoulder. Webb climbed into the passenger seat and stared at Sarah as she started the engine. "I need answers," he said. "You need a hospital. Answers can wait." She threw the Humvee into gear and punched the accelerator. The vehicle lurched forward, bouncing over terrain that would have been treacherous at walking speed. At 40 kilometers per hour, it was borderline suicidal, but staying in the area was guaranteed fatal. She drove with one hand and kept her rifle ready with the other. Hostile technical approaching from the northeast, Dalton called from the turret. He opened fire, the machine gun hammering above their heads. Tracers cut through the darkness. Sarah yanked the wheel left, and the Humvee slewed sideways, giving Dalton a better angle. He walked fire across the technical, and it exploded, adding orange flames to the green world of night vision. She corrected course and kept driving. The radio erupted with overlapping transmissions. QRF had reached the compound and was engaged with remaining hostiles. Air support was cleared hot and dropping ordnance on enemy positions. Command wanted sit-reps from everyone. The battle was still unfolding even as Sarah extracted her cargo from the immediate danger. Webb worked his radio with one hand while keeping pressure on a wound with the other. "Actual, this is Raven 6. We are extracted and moving to friendly lines. Break. Our extraction was conducted by an unknown operator using call sign Angel. Cannot confirm identity, but tactical capability is extremely high." There was a long pause before Command responded. "Raven 6, route your extraction through Rally Point Delta. QRF will secure the area and provide medical support." Webb acknowledged and turned to Sarah. "Rally Point Delta is 3 kilometers south. You know where that is?" She knew where every rally point was. She'd memorized the entire tactical map her second day on base, the same way she'd memorized guard rotations and camera blind spots and the fastest route between any 2 points in the compound. Information was survival, and old habits died hard. The Humvee ate up the distance to Rally Point Delta. Behind them, the sounds of combat faded as the QRF overwhelmed the remaining hostile forces. Air support continued working over the compound, ensuring nothing survived to threaten follow-on operations. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong, but the SEAL team was alive, and that was the only metric that mattered in the moment. Sarah pulled into Rally Point Delta and killed the engine. The QRF was already establishing a perimeter, medics rushing forward to treat casualties. She helped extract Morrison from the vehicle, his vital signs weak but stable. The tourniquets had done their job. He'd live. Dalton climbed down from the turret, favoring his wounded shoulder. "You're the motor pool mechanic," he said. His voice carried something that might have been respect or might have been shock. Probably both. She didn't respond. Medics were taking over now, professionals who specialized in saving lives instead of taking them. Her part in this operation was finished. Major Kim arrived in another Humvee, his face displaying the kind of anger that came from subordinates doing things that destroyed orderly military procedures. He approached Sarah with a clear intent to begin the court-martial process immediately. Webb intercepted him. "Major, whoever she is, she just saved my entire team. I need medical attention right now, but when I'm stable, I want a full debrief because what I just witnessed was some of the most professional tactical work I've seen in 15 years. Kim looked between Webb and Sarah, his anger warring with the undeniable fact that the SEAL team was alive when by all rights they should have been casualties or prisoners. He made a visible effort to control his expression. "You're confined to base pending investigation," he said to Sarah. "We will discuss your unauthorized actions and illegal equipment possession at length. But right now, get in the vehicle and return to the compound." Sarah climbed into the back of Kim's Humvee without argument. She'd expected this outcome. You didn't steal military equipment and conduct unauthorized combat operations without consequences. The question was whether those consequences would include a prison sentence or just the end of her carefully constructed quiet life. As they drove back toward the base, she watched the SEAL team receiving medical treatment in the distance. Morrison would recover. Dalton would recover. Webb would recover. The mission had failed, but the operators had survived. Sometimes that was the best outcome you could hope for. The base had returned to controlled chaos by the time Sarah arrived back through the main gate. Helicopters were landing with additional medical personnel. The QRF was rolling back in, vehicles dusty and battle-worn. Personnel moved between stations with a focused energy that followed combat operations. Everyone had a job, and everyone was doing it. Sarah was escorted directly to the security office, a small building near the command center that typically handled minor infractions and equipment accountability. Tonight, it was serving as a holding area for someone who had committed offenses that didn't fit into any standard category. Major Kim directed her to a chair and positioned himself behind a desk like he was conducting an official interrogation. "Explain yourself," he said. She sat in silence. Anything she said now could be used against her in whatever proceedings came next. Better to wait for legal counsel, or at least wait until command figured out what charges they wanted to file. Kim's jaw tightened. "You stole military equipment. You took an unauthorized vehicle. You inserted yourself into an active combat operation without orders or clearance. Any one of those actions is a court-martial offense. Combined, they're enough to put you in Leavenworth for a decade." Sarah maintained eye contact, but said nothing. Kim was right about the charges. Everything he'd listed was accurate, and probably just the beginning of what they could pin on her if they wanted to make an example. The door opened, and Lieutenant Webb entered, his arm in a sling, fresh bandages visible under his uniform shirt. He'd been treated and released, which meant his injuries weren't critical. That was good. Sarah had seen enough operators die from wounds that should have been survivable. "I need to speak with her," Webb said. Kim stood. "This is a security matter, Lieutenant. You should be in medical." Webb didn't move. "Major, with respect, this woman saved my team. Before anyone files charges, I want to know who she is and why she has tactical capabilities that exceed most operators I've worked with." Kim looked between them, clearly torn between military protocol and the reality that Webb had a legitimate interest in understanding what had happened. Finally, he nodded and stepped outside, leaving them alone. Webb pulled a chair close and sat down, studying her face. "I've been running operations for 15 years. I've worked with Rangers, Delta, DevGru, and contractors from a dozen different companies. What you did tonight wasn't amateur hour. That was professional-grade tactical work. Sarah remained silent. So here's what I know, Webb continued. You're listed as a vehicle mechanic, assigned to this base 6 months ago, prior service, but your file has redactions that require clearances I don't have. Your performance reports are perfect, but generic. No disciplinary issues. No notable achievements. You're invisible on paper. He leaned forward. But tonight you conducted a solo infiltration of a hostile compound, eliminated at least a dozen tangos, extracted my team under fire, and drove through enemy territory like you'd done it 1,000 times before. That's not mechanic training. That's not something you pick up watching YouTube videos. The silence stretched between them. Sarah could hear activity outside, voices calling orders, vehicles moving, the normal sounds of a forward operating base continuing its mission despite the night's events. I pulled some strings, Webb said quietly. Made some calls to people who owe me favors. Your real file is buried under classification levels that took 3 different authorization codes to access. Want to know what I found? Sarah met his eyes, but didn't speak. Nothing, Webb said. Almost nothing. Your name appears on assignment rosters for units that don't officially exist. You have commendations from operations that never happened. You were awarded medals that aren't in any public database. For the last 8 years, you were a ghost who occasionally appeared in places where highly trained operators were needed for extremely dangerous work. He sat back. Then a year ago, you vanished. No forwarding address. No contact information. 6 months later, you reappear as a mechanic at a random FOB in Afghanistan. Why? The door opened before Sarah could respond. A colonel she didn't recognize entered, his uniform carrying insignia that marked him as coming from higher command. Major Kim followed him, looking uncomfortable. Lieutenant Webb, you're dismissed, the colonel said. Sir, you're dismissed, Lieutenant. We'll handle this from here. Webb stood reluctantly, gave Sarah one last look, and left. The colonel waited until the door closed before speaking. Staff Sergeant Shun, I'm Colonel Morrison, 5th Group. I've been briefed on tonight's events, and I've reviewed your actual service record. All of it. He sat in the chair Webb had vacated. You left the unit a year ago after the Somalia operation went bad. 14 operators dead, including your team leader. The after-action report listed you as suffering from acute stress reaction, and you requested immediate reassignment to non-tactical duties. Command granted that request because, frankly, after what you'd been through, no one would blame you for wanting out. Sarah's hands tightened slightly. Somalia. She'd spent a year trying not to think about Somalia. So you became a mechanic, Morrison continued. Found a nice, quiet FOB where the most dangerous thing you'd face was a temperamental transmission. Except tonight, a SEAL team needed help and you couldn't stay in the motor pool. You went back to work. You pulled out a folder and set it on the desk. This puts command in an interesting position. On one hand, you violated about 15 regulations and showed incredibly poor judgment. On the other hand, you saved 6 operators who would otherwise be dead or captured. The Pentagon doesn't like complicated situations. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly. First words she'd spoken since returning to base. Morrison opened the folder. That depends on several factors. Lieutenant Webb is pushing hard for recognition of your actions. He wants you awarded for valor. Major Kim wants you court-martialed. And I need to decide which recommendation serves the Army's interests better. He pulled out a document covered in official seals. Here's what I'm prepared to offer. You accept an honorable discharge, effective immediately. No charges filed. No court-martial. You leave the service with your record intact, and we classify tonight's operation at a level that ensures it never sees public review. You go back to being a civilian, and we pretend this incident never happened. And if I refuse, then we proceed with charges, and you spend the next year fighting legal battles that will destroy your career regardless of the verdict. Even if you win, you'll be infamous as the operator who went rogue. Nobody will want you in their unit. Your career is over either way. Sarah looked at the discharge papers. 6 months ago, she'd wanted exactly this outcome. A clean exit from military service. A chance to build a life that didn't involve violence and death and impossible decisions. Tonight had proven she couldn't escape what she was, but maybe she could still escape what she'd been. "I'll take the discharge," she said. Morrison slid the papers across the desk. "Sign here. You have 24 hours to clear the base. Your personal effects will be shipped to whatever address you provide." She signed without reading the full document. The details didn't matter. The outcome was predetermined. Morrison collected the papers and stood. "For what it's worth, what you did tonight was extraordinary. The Army is losing a valuable asset. But sometimes valuable assets need to step away before the job breaks them completely." He left, taking the folder with him. Sarah sat alone in the security office, listening to the base continue its operations outside. Somewhere in the medical facility, Lieutenant Webb and his team were recovering from wounds that should have been fatal. They'd lived because she'd violated orders and conducted an unauthorized rescue. Worth it. Sarah spent her last night on base packing the few personal items she'd accumulated over 6 months. 2 duffel bags held everything she owned. Clothes, a few books, some tools she'd purchased herself. The life of a mechanic fit into less space than the tactical gear she'd carried on a single deployment. The motor pool sat empty at 0300 hours. She walked through it one final time, past the vehicle she'd maintained and the equipment she'd organized and the workspace that had represented her attempt at a normal life. The transmission on Vehicle 7 still hung, suspended on the jack, half removed, waiting for someone else to finish the job she'd started. She found Lieutenant Webb sitting on the hood of a Humvee near the bay entrance. His arm was still in the sling, his face showing the exhaustion that came after adrenaline wore off and pain medication kicked in. He shouldn't have been out of medical, but operators rarely followed doctors' orders when they wanted answers. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I." He gestured to the space beside him, and she climbed up, sitting on the hood like they were just 2 soldiers taking a break instead of 2 people whose lives had intersected in ways neither had planned. "Morrison told me about your discharge. Said you're leaving tomorrow. Today, technically." Sarah checked her watch. "In about 6 hours." Webb nodded slowly. "He also told me about Somalia. About what happened to your team." She didn't respond. Somalia wasn't something she discussed. Not with counselors, not with command, not with anyone who hadn't been there when everything fell apart. 14 dead, Webb continued. "You were the only survivor. Led the extraction of 2 wounded operators while under sustained enemy fire, then held position for 6 hours waiting for rescue. They wanted to give you the Medal of Honor. You refused it. I didn't deserve it. The people who died deserve to live. That's not how it works." Sarah looked at him. "That's exactly how it works. Medals are for survivors. The dead get flag-draped coffins and speeches about sacrifice. I got to keep breathing while better operators went home in boxes." The silence stretched between them. Somewhere on base, a generator hummed. A helicopter lifted off from the flight line, rotors cutting through the night air. The war continued regardless of individual trauma or collective loss. After Somalia, Webb said, "You requested reassignment to non-combat duties. Became a mechanic. Buried yourself in a job that had nothing to do with the work you'd spent a decade mastering. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Was it?" Sarah considered the question. 6 months of fixing trucks and avoiding tactical decisions and pretending she was someone different. 6 months of telling herself the past didn't define her future. Then one night of proving that training and instinct and years of experience couldn't be erased just because you changed your job description. No, she admitted. It wasn't. Webb shifted his injured arm, wincing slightly. "My team is alive because you couldn't stay a mechanic when we needed an operator. Whatever you were running from, it followed you here. The question is what you do next." I signed discharge papers. I'm done with the military. Done with the military isn't the same as done with the work. There are other organizations, private sector, contractors who need people with your skill set. I could what? Sarah's voice carried an edge. Go work for some company that drops operators into hostile countries with half the support and twice the risk? Take contracts that exist in legal gray areas because governments want deniability? I've seen what happens to operators who go that route. They either die young or live long enough to realize they're just mercenaries with better business cards. Webb fell silent. He couldn't argue the point because he'd seen the same things. The private military industry chewed up experienced operators and spat them out broken or dead. Some found meaningful work. Most just found different ways to get killed. So what's your plan? He asked. Find somewhere quiet. Get a regular job. Try to be normal. You think that'll work? Sarah thought about Somalia, about the faces of operators who trusted her leadership and died anyway, about the nightmares that woke her up at 200 hours covered in sweat and reaching for weapons that weren't there, about tonight when she put on gear and picked up a rifle and felt more like herself than she had in 6 months. Probably not, she said, but I have to try. The motor pool door opened and 3 more SEALs entered. Dalton, his shoulder bandaged but mobile. Torres, who'd taken shrapnel but refused medical evacuation. And Morrison, on crutches but conscious and alive despite the leg wound that should have killed him. They approached slowly, uncertain of their welcome. We heard you were leaving, Dalton said. Wanted to say goodbye before you disappeared. Sarah tensed. These were the men who'd dismissed her, who'd treated her like furniture, who'd never considered that the mechanic might be worth acknowledging. 6 months of being invisible, and now they showed up because she'd proven herself in the only language they respected. Look, Dalton continued, I was an asshole. We all were. You were fixing our trucks, and we acted like that made you less than us. Then you saved our lives using skills we didn't know you had. That makes us worse than assholes. That makes us blind. Torres stepped forward. Lieutenant Webb pulled your actual file. Told us what you did before becoming a mechanic. The operations you ran. The teams you led. You have more combat experience than our entire unit combined. Morrison balanced on his crutches. I was dying in that compound. The tourniquet you applied saved my life. Webb told us you carried me 200 meters while providing security. I don't remember any of it, but I'm alive because of you. Sarah looked at each of them in turn. These were good operators. Professional. Capable. They made assumptions based on job descriptions instead of investigating deeper. But that was normal. Everyone made assumptions. The military ran on them. You would have done the same for me, she said. Maybe, Webb said, but we'll never know because you didn't need saving. You were the one doing the saving. Dalton pulled something from his pocket. A challenge coin, worn and scratched from years of use. This was my team leader's. He gave it to me before he died in Iraq. Said to pass it to someone who embodied what it means to be an operator. I never found the right person until tonight. He held it out. Sarah hesitated, then took it. The metal was warm from his pocket, heavy with significance that went beyond its physical weight. Thank you, she said quietly. The men stood awkwardly for a moment. Warriors who were better at violence than vulnerability, struggling to express respect they'd failed to show when it mattered. Finally, Torres spoke. If you ever need anything, references, contacts, just someone to talk to who understands. We're here. They left, and Sarah sat alone with Webb again, the challenge coin resting in her palm. 6 months of being invisible, and in one night, she'd become visible in ways she'd been trying to avoid. The recognition felt hollow because it came from violence, but it was also honest in ways that civilian appreciation never could be. I meant what I said, Webb told her, about other opportunities. You're too good at this work to walk away permanently. I'm also too broken to keep doing it. We're all broken. That's not disqualifying. Sarah slipped the challenge coin into her pocket. Maybe, but I need to try something else first. See if there's a version of me that doesn't require combat to feel useful. And if there isn't, then I'll deal with that when it happens. Webb stood and offered his good hand. She shook it, the grip firm despite his injuries. Good luck, mechanic. Good luck, lieutenant. He walked away, leaving her alone in the motor pool one last time. The sun would rise in a few hours. She'd process out of the base, catch transport to the nearest city, and figure out what came next for someone who'd spent a decade as an operator and 6 months pretending to be something else. The transmission still hung on the jack, unfinished. Someone else would complete that job. Someone else would keep the vehicles running and the base operational. The work would continue without her because the work always continued. Operators came and went, but the mission persisted. Sarah gathered her duffel bags and walked toward the barracks for a final few hours of sleep. Tomorrow she'd be a civilian. What kind of civilian remained to be seen? The C-130 lifted off from the base at 0800 hours, carrying Sarah and 24 other personnel rotating back to the States. She watched the forward operating base shrink through the small window, the motor pool becoming just another cluster of buildings in a compound that would continue its mission without her. 6 months of routine and 1 night of violence, now reduced to a chapter she was leaving behind. The flight was long and uncomfortable, standard military transport with none of the amenities that might make 14 hours in the air tolerable. She slept in intervals, her body trained to grab rest whenever possible regardless of circumstances. The other passengers talked or played cards or stared at nothing, each processing their departure in their own way. They landed at Ramstein Air Base in Germany for refueling and crew change. Sarah walked the terminal for 30 minutes, stretching legs that had been cramped for too long, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous war. The base was massive, a small American city dropped into the German countryside, full of personnel who'd never seen combat, but wore the same uniform she'd just taken off. The second leg of the flight took them to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Sarah processed through out-processing, a series of stations where she signed forms and returned equipment and confirmed her contact information. The administrative machinery of military separation ground forward with bureaucratic efficiency. She was issued a DD-214 that documented her service in carefully sanitized language. Years of classified operations reduced to generic descriptions that said everything and nothing. By the time she walked out of the processing center, it was late afternoon, and she was officially a civilian. No uniform, no unit, no mission, just another veteran joining the millions who'd made the same transition before her. She caught a bus to Philadelphia, then a train to a small town in Pennsylvania where she'd rented an apartment site unseen. The landlord had been happy to take a deposit over the phone and didn't ask questions about employment or references. Cash in advance bought a certain amount of privacy. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom, a kitchen that was more of a kitchenette, a bathroom with plumbing that made concerning noises. Furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor, a small table, and 2 folding chairs. It was the most space she'd had to herself in years, and it felt simultaneously too large and too empty. Sarah unpacked her duffel bags. Clothes went into a closet that had room for 3 times what she owned. Books went on a shelf above the table. Tools got organized in a corner, even though she had nothing to repair. The challenge coin from Dalton sat on the windowsill, catching light from the street below. She spent the first week establishing a routine. Wake at 0500, run 5 miles, perform bodyweight exercises until failure. Shower, make coffee, spend the day applying for jobs that had nothing to do with military experience. Autoshops, manufacturing facilities, warehouses that needed people who could operate machinery. The interviews were awkward. Potential employers looked at her service record and asked careful questions about how she'd adjust to civilian work. Most didn't call back. The second week, she found work at a truck repair shop 30 minutes away. The owner was a veteran himself, Marine Corps infantry from the first Gulf War. He understood that some skills translated and some didn't, and that sometimes veterans just needed a chance to prove they could function outside the military structure. The work was familiar. Diesel engines and hydraulic systems and electrical problems that required systematic diagnosis. She was good at it because she'd been good at it in Afghanistan, and the fundamentals didn't change just because the location did. Her coworkers were friendly in the distant way that people were when they sensed someone didn't want to discuss their past. Nights were harder. She'd come home to the empty apartment and make dinner and try to find ways to fill the hours until sleep. Television held no interest. Reading required focus she couldn't maintain. She'd sit at the small table and stare at the challenge coin and wonder if she'd made a mistake leaving the only life she'd ever known how to live. The nightmares came back stronger than they'd been in Afghanistan. Somalia replayed in fragments. The ambush, the screaming, the desperate fight to extract wounded operators while bullets cut through everything. She'd wake at 200 covered in sweat, reaching for weapons that weren't there, her heart hammering like she was still under fire. On her third week, she found a shooting range 40 minutes outside town. Indoor facility, well-maintained, reasonable rates. She rented a pistol and bought ammunition and spent 2 hours putting rounds through paper targets at various distances. The familiar weight of the weapon, the smell of gunpowder, the controlled breathing between shots. It all felt natural in ways that civilian life didn't. The range officer watched her shoot and didn't say anything until she was finished. Military? Used to be. Thought so. You shoot like someone who trained for real work. She cleaned the rental pistol and returned it without comment. The range officer gave her a membership discount and told her she was welcome anytime. She drove home feeling more centered than she had since leaving Afghanistan, but also wondering what it meant that violence was the only thing that made her feel normal. Her phone rang the fourth week. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but old habits about operational security made her curious about who had her contact information. Staff Sergeant Chun? The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it immediately. This is Sarah, Lieutenant Webb. I hope I'm not calling it a bad time. She sat on the edge of her mattress. How did you get this number? I made some calls. Pulled some favors. I wanted to check in, see how you were adjusting. I'm Eufine, working at a repair shop, living quietly. Webb was silent for a moment. That's good. That's what you wanted. Yeah. The silence stretched again. Sarah could hear background noise on his end. Voices. Equipment. The unmistakable sounds of a military base continuing its operations. Look, Webb said finally. I'm not calling to pressure you into anything, but there's a situation developing. Private security contract, high-level protection detail for personnel operating in hostile territory. They need someone with your specific skill set. The pay is substantial and the work is legitimate. I gave them your name as a reference. I'm not interested. I figured, but I wanted you to have the information in case you change your mind. The contact is Marcus Reeves, former Delta, runs a small outfit that specializes in protective services. He knows your background, and he's willing to wait if you need time to think about it. I don't need time. I'm done with that work. Understood. Webb paused. How are you really doing, Sarah? She looked around the empty apartment. The challenge coin on the windowsill. The space that felt both too large and too small. The life she was trying to build that didn't quite fit. I'm adjusting, she said. That's not what I asked. I know. Webb sighed. If you need anything, someone to talk to. References for legitimate employment. Just a conversation with someone who understands. You have my number now. Thanks. Take care of yourself, mechanic. The call ended and Sarah sat in the gathering darkness, holding a phone that connected her to a world she was trying to leave behind. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of traffic outside and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Normal civilian sounds that should have been comforting but just felt hollow. She made dinner, ate without tasting it, washed the dishes, performed all the routine actions that defined her new life. And then she sat at the small table and stared at the challenge coin until it was too dark to see it anymore, wondering how long someone could run from themselves before they had to admit they'd never really left. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Sarah had left the military. She was working under a delivery truck, replacing a worn-out joint, when her phone buzzed with a news alert. Terrorist attack in Kabul. Embassy personnel frappé. Casualties mounting. She read the brief article and returned to work, but her hands moved slower, her focus drifting to people she knew who might be in that city. That night the news showed footage. Smoke rising from buildings. Desperate people running through streets. And in one brief clip, a familiar face. Lieutenant Webb, being interviewed by a reporter, his team visible in the background providing security. They looked tired, professional, doing the job she'd walked away from. Sarah turned off the television and sat in darkness. Webb was still in Afghanistan, still running operations, still putting himself in harm's way while she changed U-joints in a Pennsylvania repair shop. The rational part of her mind said he'd made his choice and she'd made hers, and both choices were valid. The irrational part, the part that had kept her alive through a decade of combat, said she'd abandoned her people. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the table and opened her laptop, searching for information about the Kabul attack. 15 dead, 30 wounded. The situation was still developing. Security forces were working to establish a perimeter. Embassy personnel were sheltering in place, waiting for extraction. Her phone rang at 0300 hours. Webb again. Did you see the news? He asked without preamble. I saw it. My team is still here. We're providing security for the evacuation. It's chaos, Sarah. Absolute chaos. We need experienced operators, and we need them now. She closed her eyes. I told you I'm done. I know what you told me. I also know what I saw in Afghanistan. You're one of the best tactical operators I've ever worked with, and right now, there are people dying because we don't have enough skilled personnel on the ground. That's not my problem anymore. Webb's voice hardened. 14 operators died in Somalia, and you've been punishing yourself ever since. You became a mechanic because fixing trucks felt safer than making tactical decisions. But tonight, while you're sitting in your apartment feeling sorry for yourself, operators are making those same decisions, and some of them are going to die because they're spread too thin. That's not fair. War isn't fair. You know that better than anyone. The silence stretched between them. Sarah could hear gunfire in the background of Webb's call. Not close, but present. The soundtrack of a combat zone continuing its work regardless of individual conversations. Marcus Reeves is putting together an emergency response team. Webb said, 6 operators. High-risk protective detail for embassy personnel extraction. He needs someone with your skill set, and he needs them in country within 72 hours. The pay is $200,000 for 6 weeks of work. Sarah stood and walked to the window. The street below was empty, peaceful, everything she'd claimed to want when she left the military. But standing here, safe, while others died, didn't feel like peace. It felt like cowardice. I need time to think, she said. You have 12 hours. After that, Reeves fills the slot with someone else, and you go back to fixing trucks while wondering if you made the right choice. Webb ended the call, and Sarah stood at the window until sunrise. She watched the town wake up. People leaving for work. Kids walking to school. All the normal civilian activities that define the life she'd been trying to build. It all looked foreign, like watching a documentary about people who lived on a different planet. At 0700, she called the repair shop and quit. Her boss understood, or at least pretended to. He'd been a Marine. He recognized the sound of someone who'd tried civilian life and found it didn't fit. He wished her luck and told her the door was always open if she changed her mind. At 0900, she called Marcus Reeves. The conversation was brief, professional, exactly what she'd expected from a former Delta operator who ran a legitimate security company. He knew her background. He knew her capabilities. He needed her in Afghanistan as soon as possible. The contract terms were clear, and the mission was straightforward. Protect embassy personnel during evacuation operations. Use whatever force necessary. Come home when the job was done. She accepted. The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. Travel arrangements, equipment acquisition, medical clearances. She moved through it all with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times to need conscious thought. Her body remembered what her mind had been trying to forget. The landlord accepted her notice without question. 1 month's rent forfeited for breaking the lease early. She packed her belongings into the same 2 duffel bags she'd arrived with, leaving behind the attempt at civilian life like it was a costume she tried on and found didn't suit her. The challenge coin went into her pocket. Everything else went into storage. She caught a flight to D.C., then a military transport to Germany, then another transport to Kabul. The flights were full of personnel moving toward the crisis, operators and support staff and diplomats who'd been called back to manage the evacuation. Everyone had that focused intensity that came before stepping into chaos. Sarah sat in silence and watched the landscape change from American suburbs to European cities to Middle Eastern deserts. Each mile taking her further from the quiet life she'd tried to build and closer to the work she'd never really left behind. The plane touched down in Kabul at 0200 hours local time. The city was burning in 3 places, visible from the air. Tracer rounds cut through the darkness. The airport was fortified with concrete barriers and razor wire, and enough firepower to hold off a sustained assault. This wasn't the controlled environment of a forward operating base. This was a city eating itself alive while the rest of the world watched on television. Marcus Reeves met her at the terminal. He was exactly what she'd expected. Mid-40s, scarred, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd survived enough violence to stop worrying about it. He shook her hand and gestured toward a waiting vehicle. "Good to have you," he said. "Webb spoke highly of your capabilities." "Webb tends to exaggerate." Reeves smiled. "That's not what I heard. Word is you conducted a solo rescue operation that saved his entire team." "That's not exaggeration. That's resume material." They drove through the airport complex toward a secured area where Reeves' team was staging. Sarah watched the chaos unfold around them. Refugees crowding against fences, soldiers maintaining perimeters, helicopters moving constantly overhead. The evacuation was massive and messy and probably killing people through sheer disorganization as much as enemy action. "Your team is already in country," Reeves said. 5 other operators, all experienced, all vetted. You'll meet them at the briefing in 30 minutes. Mission parameters are simple. Embassy personnel are sheltering in 3 locations across the city. We extract them and get them to the airport. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. Anything that threatens our principles gets eliminated. Sarah nodded. The parameters were clear. The mission was straightforward. The violence would be inevitable. This was the work she understood. The work she was good at. The work that made sense in ways that changing oil never had. "Welcome back to the war," Reeves said. She looked out at the burning city. "I never really left." He smiled and didn't argue the point because they both knew it was true. Operators didn't retire. They just took breaks between deployments and pretended they could be normal until the next crisis proved otherwise. Sarah had tried harder than most to make civilian life work, but in the end she was exactly what she'd always been. A weapon pointed at problems that couldn't be solved any other way. The vehicle pulled into the secured compound, and Sarah stepped out into the familiar chaos of a tactical operations center preparing for high-risk missions. Maps on walls, communications, gear humming, operators checking weapons and reviewing plans. This was home in ways that the Pennsylvania apartment had never been. She'd spent 6 weeks trying to be someone else. Now it was time to remember who she actually was. The briefing room held 6 operators, a map of cobble spread across the table, and Marcus Reeves standing at the head with a tablet displaying real-time intelligence. Sarah entered and 5 sets of eyes tracked her movement, assessing, measuring, wondering who the new addition was and whether she could handle the work. "This is Sarah Chun," Reeves said. "Former special operations, extensive combat experience, recent work in theater. She's filling our 6th slot." A massive operator with a beard that violated every military regulation gave her a nod. "Rodriguez, former Marine Raider. Good to have another gun." The others introduced themselves in turn. Jackson, former Ranger. Miller, former SEAL. Hayes, former Delta. Thompson, former Air Force PJ. Each of them carried the weathered confidence of operators who'd survived enough deployments to stop counting. They were evaluating her the way all operators evaluated new team members, looking for weakness or hesitation or anything that suggested she couldn't carry her weight. "We have 3 extraction sites," Reeves continued. 22 embassy personnel total. Site Alpha has 8 people in a safe house 2 kilometers from here. Site Bravo has 6 people in a commercial building that's partially compromised. Site Charlie has 8 people trapped in a residential compound that's currently surrounded by hostiles. He zoomed in on Site Charlie. "This is our priority. The other sites are secure enough to hold for a few hours. Site Charlie won't last past dawn. Hostiles are probing their defenses, and it's only a matter of time before they breach the compound." "What's the security situation?" Hayes asked. 2 diplomatic security agents with the principals. Both wounded. Limited ammunition. No heavy weapons. Their combat ineffective and waiting for rescue. Sarah studied the map. Site Charlie was deep in hostile territory, surrounded by narrow streets that would funnel any rescue force into kill zones. A conventional approach would take too long and cost too many lives. They needed something unconventional. Reeves continued. QRF is tasked to sites Alpha and Bravo. We're taking Site Charlie. 6 operators against unknown number of hostiles in an urban environment at night. Questions? How are we approaching? Miller asked. Vehicles to within 500 meters, then on foot. We breach the compound, extract the principals, and fight our way back to the vehicles. Sarah spoke for the first time. That won't work. The room went quiet. Reeves looked at her with an expression that suggested he was willing to hear her out, but wasn't thrilled about being contradicted during his first brief with her. Explain, he said. Vehicle approach puts us in a choke point. The hostiles know we're coming, and they'll hit us during extraction when we're loaded down with civilians. We'll take casualties and probably lose principals. What's your alternative? I go in first. Solo infiltration from the north. Take out sentries and establish overwatch. Once I have the compound secure, you bring vehicles in for extraction. Hostiles will be disorganized, and we'll have clear egress. Rodriguez shook his head. That's suicide. You're talking about infiltrating enemy territory alone, taking out multiple tangos without support, and somehow living long enough to call us in. Sarah met his eyes. It's what I do. Reeves studied her for a long moment. Webb mentioned you conducted a solo rescue operation in Afghanistan. Extracted his entire team from a fortified compound. That true? That's classified. Which means yes. Reeves looked around the table. I've seen her file. The unredacted version. If she says she can do this, she can do this. The other operators exchanged glances, but didn't argue. In this business, you trusted the team leader's judgment where you found a different team. Reeves had built his reputation on making good calls. If he vouched for the new operator, that was enough. Sarah goes in first, Reeves said. Radio check in 15 minutes. If she's not in position in 30, we execute conventional assault. Everyone clear? They geared up in silence. Sarah checked her weapon, loaded magazines, mounted night vision to her helmet. The equipment was top tier, better than military issue, the kind of gear that private contractors could afford because they weren't constrained by Pentagon budgets. Her rifle felt perfect in her hands. The body armor distributed weight exactly right. She was ready. The team rolled out in 2 vehicles at 0300 hours. Kabul at night was a maze of burning buildings and abandoned streets. They saw scattered civilians fleeing the violence, but mostly the city belonged to fighters who were settling scores and pursuing vendettas under cover of chaos. They stopped 500 meters from Site Charlie. Sarah slipped out of the vehicle without a word and disappeared into the darkness. Behind her, the team would wait and monitor her radio and prepare to execute if she failed. Standard operating procedure. Everyone had a job. She moved through the streets with practiced stealth. The night vision turned the world green and flat, highlighting threats before they could highlight her. 2 hostiles guarding an intersection. She bypassed them through a building, moving room to room, checking corners, ensuring her 6 was clear. The compound appeared ahead. 3-story residential building, walls on 3 sides, the 4th side open to the street. She counted 12 hostiles visible on the exterior. More would be inside. The embassy personnel were trapped on the 2nd floor, windows dark, waiting for rescue or death. Sarah circled to the north side and scaled the wall using a drainage pipe that was probably older than the current conflict. She moved across the roof in absolute silence, clearing each section before advancing. 2 hostiles on the roof, smoking cigarettes, their weapons slung casually. They died before they understood they were under attack. She keyed her radio once. Position secured. Beginning interior clearance. The building had 4 hostiles on the 3rd floor. She eliminated them in sequence, moving room to room with surgical precision. Suppressed weapon. Controlled shots. No wasted movement. Each hostile dropped without alerting others. 2nd floor held the embassy personnel. 6 civilians, 2 wounded security agents, all crowded in one room with furniture barricaded against the door. Sarah cleared the adjacent rooms first, ensuring no hostiles were preparing to breach. Then she knocked on the barricaded door in the tactical pattern that identified friendly forces. The door opened slightly. One of the security agents, his face pale from blood loss, stared at her in confusion. "I'm your extraction," she said. "Stay quiet and stay behind me." She led them to the stairwell, moving slowly because civilians didn't have tactical training. Behind her, the security agents provided rear security despite their wounds. Professional to the end. Ground floor held 8 hostiles gathered in what had been a living room. Sarah evaluated angles and distances. The civilians were vulnerable. The security agents were barely mobile. A sustained firefight would get people killed. She pulled a flashbang from her kit and tossed it into the room. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Before the hostiles could recover, she was moving through the door, engaging targets with rapid precision. 8 hostiles, 16 rounds, 8 seconds. The room went silent except for ringing ears and the whimper of a wounded civilian who'd hit the ground too hard. "Reeves," she radioed. "Compound secure. Bring vehicles to north entrance." "Copy. Rolling now." The team arrived 90 seconds later, vehicles screaming up to the compound entrance. Sarah had the civilians ready, organized into a movement formation that minimized exposure. They loaded into the vehicles with practiced efficiency. Rodriguez stared at her as she climbed in. "You just cleared an entire compound solo." "That was the plan." "How many tangos?" 14. Jesus Christ. The vehicles rolled toward the airport, taking indirect routes that avoided known hostile positions. Sarah watched the city burn through the window, tracking possible threats, reading the environment the way she'd been trained to do. The civilians sat in shocked silence. The security agents were getting medical treatment from Thompson. Everyone was alive. The mission clock showed 38 minutes from infiltration to extraction. Textbook operation. No friendly casualties. All principals safe. Reeves caught her eye from the driver's seat. "You do that often?" "When necessary." Webb wasn't exaggerating about you. Sarah didn't respond. The compliment was appreciated but unnecessary. She'd done the job she'd been hired to do, using skills she'd spent a decade developing. This was what she was good at, what she'd always been good at. Civilian life had been the aberration. This was normal. They reached the airport as dawn broke over Kabul. The evacuation was ongoing, thousands of people desperate to escape, military forces working to maintain order. Sarah's team delivered the embassy personnel to the processing center and returned to their compound for debriefing. The other operators looked at her differently now, not with skepticism, but with respect earned through demonstrated capability. She'd proven herself in the only way that mattered in this business, by doing the impossible and making it look routine. "Welcome to the team," Hayes said. Sarah nodded. It was good to be back. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. Marcus Reeves walked through every phase of the operation while the team provided details from their perspectives. When he reached Sarah's solo infiltration, the room went quiet. Everyone had heard the radio traffic. Everyone knew what she'd accomplished. But hearing it laid out in tactical detail made the achievement even more impressive. 14 hostiles eliminated. 0 rounds wasted. Complete surprise maintained throughout. Reeves looked at his tablet. "This is some of the cleanest operational work I've seen in 20 years. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "I've been doing this job since Iraq. Run maybe 300 missions. Never seen anyone clear a building that efficiently." Miller nodded. "SEAL training emphasizes team tactics. We don't do solo infiltrations because they're statistically suicide." "What unit trained you for that?" Sarah kept her expression neutral. "The kind that doesn't exist on paper." The operators exchanged glances. They understood the implication. Special access programs. Compartmented operations. The units that conducted missions no one acknowledged and trained operators in techniques that violated conventional doctrine because conventional doctrine assumed you'd have backup. Hayes spoke up. "I worked with Delta for 6 years. Saw operators who could pull off solo work in permissive environments. But you just did it in the middle of Kabul with hostiles on high alert. That's a different level. Training is training," Sarah said. "Fundamentals don't change based on environment." Reeves closed his tablet. "Regardless of where you learned it, we need more of it. We have 4 more extraction operations over the next 72 hours. Sites across the city, all high risk, all time sensitive." "Sarah, your point on tactical planning. The team spent the afternoon reviewing intelligence and developing courses of action. Sarah found herself naturally slipping into a leadership role, identifying vulnerabilities and proposing solutions based on her read of the tactical environment. The other operators listened and contributed, creating a collaborative dynamic that only happened when everyone respected everyone else's capabilities. The second extraction operation launched that night. Embassy personnel, trapped in a hotel surrounded by hostile forces. Sarah proposed a rooftop insertion using helicopters, something that would normally require extensive planning and support. Reeves approved it with the caveat that they had exactly one pass to get it right. They fast-stroked onto the hotel roof at 200 hours. Sarah led the team down through 14 floors of potential threats, clearing each level with systematic efficiency. The embassy personnel were located and extracted within 18 minutes. 2 hostile contacts, both eliminated before they could raise an alarm. The team was back at the compound before dawn. Rodriguez approached her in the equipment room afterward. "You make this look easy." "It's not easy. It's just practiced." "How many operations have you run?" Sarah considered the question while cleaning her rifle. "Enough that I stopped counting." He sat on an equipment crate. "Webb told me about Somalia. Said you were the only survivor from a 14-person team." She paused in her cleaning, but didn't look up. "That's not something I discuss." "Fair enough. But for what it's worth, the fact that you're still operational after that kind of trauma says something about your character." Sarah resumed, cleaning her rifle. "Or it says I don't know how to do anything else." Rodriguez stood. "I think it says you're exactly what you appear to be. A professional who keeps showing up and doing the work regardless of cost. That's worth something in this business." He left, and Sarah finished cleaning her weapon in solitude. The compound was quiet in the pre-dawn hours, just the hum of generators and the distant sounds of a city tearing itself apart. She'd been back in theater for less than 48 hours and already felt more centered than she had during 6 weeks of civilian life. That probably said something about her psychology, but she didn't have the energy to analyze it. The third extraction operation happened 2 days later. A convoy ambush had pinned down diplomatic personnel in a disabled vehicle 3 kilometers from the airport. Sarah's team rolled out to provide relief, moving through streets that had become battlegrounds. They reached the ambush site, and Sarah coordinated a tactical withdrawal under fire, using vehicles as mobile cover while extracting the wounded. Jackson took a round through his plate carrier that knocked him down but didn't penetrate. Sarah dragged him to cover while returning fire with her sidearm. Miller provided suppressing fire from the turret. Hayes drove through hostile positions at speeds that turned the armored vehicle into a battering ram. They extracted all personnel and returned to base with minor injuries and vehicles that looked like they'd been through a demolition derby. The fourth extraction was the hardest. A safe house had been compromised, and 6 embassy personnel were trapped with only hours before hostile forces would overwhelm their position. The conventional approach would take too long. Sarah proposed something unconventional. She infiltrated alone again, this time in broad daylight, disguised as a local civilian. Moved through checkpoints by speaking the language she'd learned during previous deployments. Reached the safe house and coordinated with the trapped personnel to stage a diversion that drew hostile attention away from the extraction route. When Reeves' team rolled in, Sarah had already cleared the path, and the extraction took less than 5 minutes. That evening, the entire team gathered in the compound common area. Thompson produced a bottle of whiskey that probably violated several regulations, but no one cared. They poured drinks and raised glasses to successful operations and living through another day. Reeves stood to Sarah Chun, who has proven herself to be one of the most capable operators any of us have worked with. "Welcome to the team." They drank, and Sarah felt something she hadn't felt since before Somalia. Acceptance. Not just acknowledgement of her skills, but genuine respect from people whose opinions mattered. These operators had seen her work under the worst possible conditions and found her not just adequate, but exceptional. Miller refilled her glass. "You know what the difference is between you and most operators?" "What?" "Most of us are good at 1 or 2 things. Room clearing or long-range shooting or tactical planning. You're exceptional at all of it. That's rare. Hayes nodded. I worked with SEAL Team 6 operators who couldn't do half what you did this week. Whatever unit trained you, they built something special. Sarah sipped her whiskey. They built a weapon. Whether that's special or tragic depends on your perspective. Rodriguez raised his glass. In this business, we need weapons. Good ones. Ones that work when everything else fails. That's you. The conversation shifted to war stories and shared experiences. Sarah listened more than she talked, but she participated. Let herself be part of the team instead of holding herself apart. For the first time since Somalia, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Lieutenant Webb called her later that night. Heard you've been busy in Kabul. For successful extractions. 0 friendly casualties. Reeves is very impressed. How'd you hear about that? I have sources. Sarah, I told you that you were too good at this work to walk away permanently. She looked out at the burning city. You were right. I tried civilian life and it didn't fit. Because you're an operator. That's not a weakness. That's just reality. Some people are built for this work. And some people get broken by it. Webb was quiet for a moment. You're not broken, Sarah. Damaged maybe, but still functional. Still capable. Still doing the work that needs doing. That's a low bar for success. It's the only bar that matters in a war zone. You're keeping people alive. That counts for something. They talked for a few more minutes before Sarah ended the call. She returned to the common area where her team was still swapping stories. Rodriguez was demonstrating something with his hands. Miller was laughing. Hayes was refilling glasses. Thompson had fallen asleep on a couch. This was the life she tried to leave behind. Violence and danger and impossible missions that somehow got accomplished anyway. But it was also camaraderie and purpose and the knowledge that the work mattered even when it cost everything. Sarah poured another drink and joined the conversation. For tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be. Tomorrow would bring more extractions and more danger and more reasons to question whether this life was sustainable. But tonight, she was an operator among operators, doing work that only they could do. And that was enough. The evacuation operations concluded after 6 weeks of sustained combat. Sarah's team had conducted 23 successful extractions, protected over 200 embassy personnel, and operated in some of the most dangerous environments Kabul had to offer. 0 friendly casualties. 0 principals lost. The kind of operational record that would never make it into official reports, but would be whispered about in operator communities for years. The final mission was almost anticlimactic. A small group of contractors trapped near the airport perimeter. Sarah's team rolled out, extracted them under minimal fire, and returned to base as the sun rose over a city that had finally exhausted its capacity for violence. The war wasn't over, but this particular chapter was closing. Marcus Reeves gathered the team in the briefing room one last time. Our contract is complete. Embassy personnel are evacuated. Kabul belongs to whoever wants it now. You've all performed exceptionally, and I'm grateful to have worked with operators of your caliber. He looked at Sarah. Special recognition to Sarah Chun, who joined us mid-operation and proved to be one of the most tactically proficient operators I've encountered in 20 years of this work. Her contributions were invaluable. The team offered nods and quiet acknowledgments. They'd moved past needing to verbalize respect. Everyone knew what everyone had contributed. Reeves continued, "We have contract available for those interested in continuing this work. Yemen, Somalia, several locations in Africa. Same pay structure, similar risk profile. Think about it and let me know." Sarah already knew her answer. She'd spent 6 weeks proving she was still capable of elite-level operations. The question was whether she wanted to continue proving it for the rest of her life or find some other path that made use of her skills without requiring constant exposure to violence. The team dispersed to pack gear and prepare for transport home. Sarah found herself on the compound roof, watching helicopters lift off from the airport. The evacuation was complete. Thousands of people had escaped. Thousands more hadn't. That was the arithmetic of war. You saved who you could and lived with the fact that you couldn't save everyone. Rodriguez joined her. Thinking about Reeves' offer? Considering it. You should take it. You're too good at this work to go back to fixing trucks. Sarah smiled. That's what everyone keeps telling me. Because it's true. Rodriguez leaned against the roof wall. I've worked with a lot of operators. Most are good at their jobs. Some are great. You're something else entirely. You have instincts that can't be taught and skills that take decades to develop. Walking away from that feels like a waste. Or maybe it's survival. Sarah watched another helicopter disappear into the distance. Every operator I know who stayed in this business too long ended up dead or broken. There's no retirement plan for people like us. True, but there's also no purpose in civilian life for people built the way we're built. You tried it. Did it work? She thought about the Pennsylvania apartment, the repair shop, the empty nights and the nightmares, and the constant feeling of being a weapon without a target. It hadn't worked because she'd been trying to be something she wasn't. No, she admitted. It didn't work. So you have two choices. Keep taking contracts until something kills you, or find a way to use these skills in something sustainable. Is there a third option? Rodriguez shrugged. Teach. Train the next generation. Pass on what you know to operators who need it. I've heard about programs that place experienced contractors in training roles. Less field work, more mentorship. Still connected to the community, but with lower operational tempo. Sarah considered it. Teaching meant staying connected to the work without being consumed by it. Using her experience to improve others instead of constantly risking her own life. It wasn't perfect, but it was more sustainable than another decade of high-risk contracts. Would I find these programs? I'll send you contacts. Rodriguez pushed off the wall. Think about it. You've proven everything you need to prove. Maybe it's time to let someone else do the proving while you show them how. He left, and Sarah remained on the roof until the call came to board transport. The team loaded into vehicles for the drive to the airport, then onto a C-130 that would take them to Germany for debrief and processing. The flight was quieter than the one that had brought her to Kabul. Everyone was exhausted, running on empty, ready for beds that didn't require security rotations. They landed in Germany 18 hours later. The debrief took 3 days. Sarah provided detailed after-action reports for each operation, walking commanders through tactical decisions and lessons learned. The military officers conducting the debrief treated her with deference that came from reading operational summaries and recognizing exceptional work. On the 4th day, she was cleared to return to the States. Hayes, Miller, and Thompson were taking new contracts. Rodriguez was rotating home for 2 weeks before deploying to Yemen. Jackson had decided to retire, his close call during the convoy extraction convincing him he'd used up his luck. Sarah caught a commercial flight to Philadelphia, then took a train to the small Pennsylvania town where her belongings were still in storage. She retrieved her duffel bags, paid the storage fees, and stood in the parking lot trying to decide what came next. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lieutenant Webb. Heard you survived Kabul. Well done. If you're looking for something sustainable, I know people at Fort Bragg who run advanced tactical training. They need instructors with your background. Let me know if interested. Another text came from Rodriguez, sending those teaching program contacts like I promised. You'd be good at it. Consider it. Sarah looked at her duffel bags. Everything she owned in 2 bags. No apartment, no job, no plan, but also no obligation to be anything other than what she actually was. An operator who tried to stop being an operator and discovered it wasn't possible. She pulled out the challenge coin Dalton had given her months ago. The metal was worn smooth from being carried in her pocket through 2 deployments. It represented recognition from people who understood what the work required. Respect earned through demonstrated capability in situations where capability was the only currency that mattered. She typed a response to Webb. Interested. Send details. Then she called the Fort Bragg contact number Rodriguez had sent. The conversation was brief. They needed experienced instructors. She had the background they were looking for. The position offered stability, purpose, and connection to the operator community without requiring constant field deployment. It wasn't perfect, but perfect didn't exist in this line of work. She accepted the position and booked a flight to North Carolina. The teaching role would start in 2 weeks, giving her time to find an apartment near base and prepare for a life that balanced her capabilities with something approaching sustainability. She wouldn't be fixing trucks and pretending to be normal. She'd be training operators and passing on knowledge that could keep them alive. It was the compromise she'd been searching for, a way to use what she was without being consumed by it, a path that acknowledged her nature while creating space for something beyond constant violence. Sarah stood in the parking lot and felt something close to peace. Not the peace of safety or comfort, but the peace of acceptance. She was an operator. That identity came with costs, but it also came with purpose. The challenge was finding ways to serve that purpose without sacrificing everything else. She loaded her duffel bags into a rental car and started driving south, toward Fort Bragg, toward a new role that would let her be exactly who she was while helping others become what they needed to be. The nightmares would probably continue. The memories of Somalia would never fully fade. But she'd stopped running from herself, and that was progress. What did you think of Sarah's journey from dismissed mechanic to recognized operator? Does her story resonate with your own experiences of being underestimated? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The highway stretched ahead, carrying her toward whatever came next. She'd been a soldier, a mechanic, a contractor, and now she'd be an instructor. Different roles, but the same fundamental truth underneath. She was someone who stepped forward when others needed help, regardless of the cost. And sometimes that was enough.